The grand ballroom of the Astoria Royale glowed with opulence, the chandeliers casting golden reflections on the polished marble floors. Waiters in crisp white gloves moved with precision, balancing silver trays adorned with glasses of champagne and delicacies most people couldn't pronounce. It was the most anticipated charity gala of the season, and only the elite had been invited. Rayhan stood near the large glass windows, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass, watching the city lights twinkle below. From the outside, he had everything: unimaginable wealth, power, and a reputation that commanded both respect and fear. But as he glanced around the crowded hall, watching socialites engage in empty conversations, laughter that didn't quite reach their eyes, and businessmen shaking hands over already sealed deals, he felt something strange, an emptiness he couldn't explain. Christmas had never meant much to him. To his family, it was another day to showcase their wealth, to remind the world that they sat at the top. But tonight, for the first time, something gnawed at him, as if he was missing something important, something real. As he took another sip of his drink, his eyes wandered lazily over the guests, dressed in designer gowns, adorned with jewels worth millions, until they landed on someone who didn't belong. His breath hitched. Across the hall, near the entrance, stood a woman he never thought he'd see again. Leora. His fingers tightened around the glass, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. Time had changed her, yet she was still the same. Her dark, wavy hair framed her delicate face, her eyes scanning the room with an expression of quiet discomfort. She didn't belong here, and she knew it. But it wasn't just her presence that sent a jolt through his system. Standing beside her were two children, a boy and a girl, holding on to her hands. And even from across the room, even with the dim lighting, the recognition struck him like a physical blow. The boy, no older than 6, had the same sharp cheekbones, the same deep-set eyes, the same intense expression Rayhan often saw in the mirror. The girl, a year or 2 younger, had his exact nose, his signature dark brown hair. They looked like him. Too much like him. A slow, eerie chill crept up his spine. The ballroom noise faded into a distant hum as he stood frozen in place. His mind raced, trying to grasp the impossible. He hadn't seen Leora in years, not since she vanished from his life without a trace, without a word. And now, here she was, standing in his world, with 2 children who looked exactly like him. His fingers loosened, and he barely noticed when his drink slipped from his grip, shattering against the floor. The sound cut through the background chatter, but Rayhan didn't flinch. He was too busy staring at the woman who had once meant everything to him, now standing there like a ghost from a past he had long tried to forget. Leora's eyes finally met his, and for a brief moment, time stopped. She froze, her expression shifting from surprise to something deeper, guilt. Panic. The kind of panic that only comes when someone is caught in a secret they desperately wanted to keep hidden. She looked away quickly, grabbing the hands of the children and tugging them closer. She was about to leave. She wanted to run. Rayhan's pulse roared in his ears. No. Not this time. Without thinking, he moved. His long strides cut through the crowd effortlessly, the murmurs of confused guests barely registering in his mind. His only focus was on the woman who was now rushing toward the exit. Why is she running? His heart pounded. He had a million questions, but only one mattered: were they mine? His chest tightened at the thought. Had he unknowingly been a father for years without ever knowing? The boy, holding a small, worn-out teddy bear, glanced back at Rayhan curiously, his big eyes locking onto his. It was like looking into a reflection of his younger self, a version untouched by the weight of success, betrayal, and loss. Something inside him twisted painfully. He reached them just as Leora pushed through the heavy doors, stepping into the cold night. Leora. His voice came out harsher than he intended, raw with emotions he hadn't even processed yet. She flinched, but didn't turn. He grabbed her wrist gently, forcing her to stop. Wait, he said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. She exhaled sharply, keeping her gaze firmly away from his. Let us go, Rayhan. Please. his jaw tightened. I don't think I can. He glanced down at the children, who were watching the interaction silently, sensing the tension but too young to understand it fully. Who are they? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Are they? His throat tightened before he could finish. Leora's hand clenched around the little girl's shoulder, protectively. They're my children, she said, her voice carefully measured. Not our children. Mine. The distinction sent a sharp pain through him. He studied her, searching for answers in her expression, but she was unreadable, except for her eyes. Those eyes held secrets, regrets, and something else, fear. She was hiding something. Tell me the truth, he demanded. Are they mine? Leora swallowed hard. For a split second, her lips parted as if she might say something, but then she closed her mouth, shaking her head. It doesn't matter, Rayhan. You live your life. I live mine. Just let us be. But it did matter. It mattered more than anything had ever mattered before. Because the way those children looked at him, the way something unspoken passed between them, he already knew the answer. They were his. And somehow, for reasons he couldn't yet understand, she had spent years keeping them a secret from him. Rayhan's fingers remained wrapped around Leora's wrist, his grip firm but not forceful, as though he was afraid that if he let go, she would vanish again, just like she had all those years ago. The cold night air bit through his tailored suit, but he barely noticed. His heart pounded against his ribs, his thoughts colliding in a frantic, desperate spiral. He was a man accustomed to having answers, to being in control of every situation. But this was chaos, uncertainty, and a storm of emotions he had never prepared for. The two children stood just beside Leora, their small faces turned up toward him, eyes wide with a curiosity that unsettled him. The boy clutched his old teddy bear tighter, his little fingers digging into the worn fabric. The girl, slightly younger, had Leora's delicate features, but his dark, questioning gaze. And for the life of him, he couldn't understand how he had been oblivious to their existence until now. Leora yanked her wrist free, stepping back as if needing distance to breathe. She pulled the children closer, her arms instinctively protective. Rayhan, let this go, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. This isn't your world. It never was. A bitter laugh escaped his lips before he could stop it. Not my world? He gestured vaguely toward the children, his hand shaking slightly. You think I can just walk away now? After what I saw tonight? He exhaled sharply, trying to control the whirlwind inside him. You disappeared. No warning, no goodbye. Just, gone. And now, after all these years, I see you with two kids who, he broke off, his throat tightening. His gaze flickered to them again, and the realization hit him all over again. They are mine. I know they are. Leora shook her head, wrapping her coat tighter around herself. You don't get to do this, she said, her voice low, but fierce. You don't get to act like you were searching for me. You moved on. Your life went on. You never looked back, did you? Her words hit like a slap, but Rayhan refused to back down. I couldn't look back, he shot back. I had nothing to look for. You left without a trace. No phone call. No explanation. Do you have any idea how many times I wondered why? How many times I asked myself what I did wrong? Leora's face flickered with something, pain, regret, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. It doesn't matter anymore, she murmured. We have nothing to say to each other. Rayhan's jaw clenched. Don't do that. Don't shut me out again. He inhaled deeply, trying to steady his voice. I need to know the truth, Leora. I need to know if they're mine. Leora turned to the kids, her expression softening in a way that made Rayhan's chest tighten. She placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and whispered something he couldn't hear. The boy hesitated, his small hands tightening around the teddy bear, before nodding. Then, slowly, he reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out something small and crumpled. Without a word, he stepped forward and handed it to Rayhan. Rayhan took it, unfolding the paper with stiff fingers. His breath caught in his throat. It was a drawing. A child's drawing, scribbled with colored pencils, the lines unsteady but full of effort. It showed 4 stick figures. One was clearly Leora, her dark hair drawn in long strokes. 2 smaller figures stood beside her, the boy and the girl, their features unmistakable. And then there was the last figure, taller, dressed in a suit. But it wasn't just anyone. It was him. Rayhan's hands trembled as he stared at the image. He looked at the boy, his eyes searching, demanding silent answers. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The boy hesitated, then said in a quiet, uncertain voice, "That's Daddy." The air rushed from Rayhan's lungs, and for a moment, he thought the world had tilted on its axis. He felt the weight of years lost pressing down on him, the life he never knew he had, the memories he was never a part of. His head snapped up to Leora, and he saw it now, the truth written plainly in her expression. She had lied. She had kept them from him. And she had never planned to tell him. A storm raged inside him, anger, disbelief, pain, all colliding into something unbearable. "So it's true," he whispered, his voice almost breaking. "They are mine." Leora's lips parted, but no words came out. She looked away, blinking rapidly, as if holding back tears. Finally, she swallowed and nodded. "Yes," she admitted. "They're yours." The confirmation knocked the breath out of him. He stumbled back a step, his mind reeling. The gravity of what she had stolen from him, the birthdays he had missed, the scraped knees he never bandaged, the bedtime stories he never read, it all hit him at once. He felt like he was drowning in a sea of emotions, too vast to control. His voice, when he finally spoke, was strained. "Why?" He stared at her, his entire body trembling with the weight of the question. "Why did you keep them from me?" Leora hesitated, then exhaled shakily. "Because I had to," she said. "Because I didn't have a choice." Rayhan's eyes burned into hers. "That's not an answer." She looked at the children, then back at him, her shoulders sagging under the weight of a secret too heavy to carry alone. "It's not a simple story, Rayhan," she murmured. "You don't know everything." "Then tell me," he demanded. "Because you don't get to make that decision for me. You don't get to decide whether I should have been a father or not." His voice wavered slightly, but he steadied it. "You owe me the truth." Leora stared at him for a long time. The silence stretched between them, thick with things unsaid. Then, she finally sighed, a sound so weary it made something inside him ache. "If you want the truth," she whispered, "then be ready. Because it's not what you think." Rayhan didn't flinch. He was ready for anything but what came next. Rayhan stood motionless, his heart pounding like a war drum inside his chest. The truth sat on the tip of Leora's tongue, just out of reach, wrapped in a hesitance that both terrified and infuriated him. The night stretched cold and endless around them, the holiday lights twinkling mockingly in the distance. Somewhere, people were celebrating, laughing, exchanging gifts, and indulging in the warmth of family. But here, on this quiet city sidewalk, Rayhan felt anything but warmth. He felt the icy grip of a past that had been stolen from him. His children, had been growing up without him, and he had been oblivious. He needed answers. He needed to know why. Leora sighed, rubbing her hands over her arms as if trying to shield herself from the inevitable. Her gaze flickered to the children, then back to him, uncertainty tightening her features. "Not here," she finally said, her voice quieter now, less defensive. "Not in front of them." Rayhan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He didn't want to wait, didn't want to be patient, but one look at the 2 small figures standing between them, their eyes round with confusion, and he knew she was right. Whatever truth she held was not meant for their ears. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to take control of the storm raging inside him. "Fine," he said, voice clipped. "Let's go somewhere and talk." Leora hesitated, glancing around like a caged animal looking for an escape route. Rayhan clenched his jaw, realizing that she still didn't trust him. After all these years, after all the time lost, she still thought he might walk away. Or worse, destroy whatever fragile life she had built. I live nearby, she finally admitted. We can talk there. Rayhan nodded, barely suppressing the need to demand why she hadn't come to him sooner, why she had let him miss out on everything. But he held his tongue. He had waited years for answers. He could wait a little longer. The walk was silent, heavy with tension. The city around them was alive with holiday spirit, children laughing, couples walking hand in hand, carolers singing in the distance, but none of it touched them. Rayhan had always prided himself on his ability to control a room, to dominate conversations, to turn deals in his favor with just the right words. But here, with Leora and the children walking beside him, he was at a loss. How did you reclaim something you never even knew was taken? How did you become a father to children who didn't even know you existed? Leora's apartment was small, tucked away in a part of town Rayhan never would have imagined her living in. It wasn't unsafe, but it was a world away from the wealth and luxury he had always associated with her. She had once worn designer clothes, walked in circles of privilege, dreamed of a future alongside him. But now, as she led them up the narrow stairs of an aging brick building, he realized just how far she had fallen from that life. And he had never known. Inside, the apartment was warm, despite its modest size. The furniture was second-hand but well cared for, and children's drawings covered the walls. A tiny Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with homemade ornaments and paper snowflakes. There were no expensive gifts beneath it, no sparkling diamonds or luxury watches, just a few wrapped boxes, likely containing simple toys or books. The sight made something twist deep in Rayhan's chest. He had spent the last 10 years building an empire, drowning in wealth, never once thinking about what he was missing. And here, in this small, ordinary home, was everything he never knew he wanted. Leora guided the children into their room, whispering to them before closing the door. When she turned back to face him, she looked exhausted, as though she had been carrying a burden too heavy for too long. Rayhan didn't give her time to stall. "Tell me," he said, his voice low, demanding. "Tell me why you left. Tell me why you kept them from me." Leora's fingers curled into fists at her sides, her shoulders tense. "I tried to tell you, Rayhan," she said bitterly. "You think I wanted to disappear? You think I wanted to raise them alone?" Rayhan frowned, his pulse hammering. "Then why?" She took a deep breath, her eyes dark with something he couldn't quite place, something raw and painful. "Because your family made sure I had no other choice." Rayhan's stomach dropped. He took a step forward, his mind racing. "What are you talking about?" Leora let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "They paid me to leave." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Rayhan stared at her, his mind refusing to process the weight of what she had just said. "That's not possible," he said, shaking his head. "I would have known." "No, you wouldn't have," Leora whispered. "They made sure of that." Rayhan felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. His father. His family. The people he had spent his entire life trying to impress, to prove himself to. They had taken everything from him, his children, the woman he had loved, and he had never even known. "Tell me everything," he demanded, his voice dangerously low. Leora's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "The night I found out I was pregnant, I went to see you. I was scared, Rayhan. We weren't perfect, but I thought you deserved to know. But I never made it to you. Your father intercepted me. He already knew. He told me that a woman like me had no place in your world. That I was nothing but a distraction, a mistake." Rayhan's fists clenched. He could almost hear his father's voice, cold and calculating, weaving the perfect trap. Leora continued, voice breaking. "He gave me an ultimatum. He said if I truly cared about you, I would leave. That if I stayed, he would ruin me. Make sure no one would ever hire me. That my children would be born into nothing. She swallowed hard. And then he handed me a check. More money than I had ever seen in my life. Enough to make me disappear. Enough to convince me that walking away was the only way to protect them. Rayhan's body went rigid, his vision swimming with rage. His own father. His own blood. He had orchestrated the biggest lie of his life, stolen his children, shattered the one thing that had ever truly mattered. He had never felt hate like this before. Leora met his gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. That's the truth, Rayhan. You were never supposed to know. But now he did. And nothing would ever be the same. Rayhan sat in stunned silence, the weight of Leora's words pressing down on him like an unbearable force. The walls of the small apartment felt like they were closing in, suffocating him. His father, his own flesh and blood, had stolen everything from him, shaping his life with a lie so cruel that it left a bitter taste in his mouth. His mind reeled, trying to piece together the past with this new, horrifying truth. It had all been a game to them, a strategic move to protect the family's pristine reputation. His love, his future, his children, they had been nothing more than collateral damage in a war he hadn't even known he was fighting. Leora watched him carefully, her arms folded across her chest as if bracing for an explosion. But there was no need. The anger that coursed through Rayhan was not a wildfire, it was something deeper, colder. A rage that settled into his bones, one that wouldn't burn out but would instead fuel him until justice was served. He inhaled sharply, his hands curled into tight fists on his lap. And you never thought to tell me? His voice came out low and dangerous, but beneath it was something else, hurt. A raw, open wound that had just been ripped apart all over again. Leora sighed, running a hand through her dark hair, looking suddenly exhausted. I wanted to, she admitted. God, Rayhan, I wanted to so many times. But how was I supposed to? After what your father did, I was terrified. I was broke, pregnant, alone. He made sure I had no options. Do you really think I wanted to raise them without you? She swallowed hard. There were nights I stared at my phone, desperate to call you. I used to sit outside your office just to catch a glimpse of you, wondering if you'd recognize me, wondering if you'd care. But every time I thought I might finally reach out. I remembered what your father said. That you wouldn't choose me. That if I ever came back, it wouldn't just ruin me, it would ruin you, too. Rayhan's jaw clenched, his nails digging into his palms. He was wrong, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I would have chosen you. The words felt heavy, filled with all the lost years, all the moments he would never get back. He looked at the closed bedroom door where his children slept, unaware of the storm raging just beyond their small world. His children. His. He should have been there when they took their first steps, when they spoke their first words. He should have been the one they turned to, not a stranger they had met only hours ago. The thought nearly shattered him. Leora sat down across from him, her fingers twisting together anxiously. What now? She asked, her voice laced with exhaustion. You know the truth. You know why I did what I did. But that doesn't change anything, does it? There was something deeply vulnerable in her gaze, something unspoken. She was afraid. Not just of him taking the children away, but of letting him in, of trusting him after all these years. Rayhan ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. His world had been turned upside down in the span of a single evening, but there was one thing he was sure of. He wasn't going to let his father dictate his life anymore. I don't know what happens next, he admitted. But I know one thing. I'm not walking away. He leaned forward, his voice firm. I'm staying. Whether you like it or not, I'm their father. And I want to be in their lives. Leora bit her lip, as if holding back emotions too strong to process. They don't know you, Rayhan, she whispered. They've never had a father. You can't just walk in and, I won't just walk in and take over, he interrupted. I know I can't fix everything overnight. I know I can't undo what's already happened. But I can start now. His gaze softened, his frustration melting into something more vulnerable. Let me be here for them, Leora. Let me know them. Leora's eyes shimmered, torn between old wounds and the possibility of something new. And what if they don't want you? Rayhan swallowed the lump in his throat. That was a very real possibility. He had spent years being a billionaire, a businessman, a power player, but never a father. What if his children wanted nothing to do with him? The thought made his stomach twist. But he had to try. Then I'll keep showing up until they do. A heavy silence stretched between them, both of them lost in the gravity of the moment. Finally, Leora sighed, rubbing her temples. They're asleep now. But, maybe tomorrow. Rayhan nodded, relief washing over him. Tomorrow. It was the smallest of openings, but it was something. He would take it. That night, as he lay in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling, sleep refused to come. For the first time in years, his thoughts weren't on his empire, his business deals, or the endless chase for more. They were on two little faces, two sets of eyes that mirrored his own. He had spent years thinking wealth was the ultimate achievement, the only measure of success. But tonight, with the weight of everything crashing down on him, he realized just how poor he truly was. He had millions, yet he had missed the most priceless moments of his life. And now, he would do anything, to make sure he never missed another one. Rayhan barely slept that night. His mind was a battlefield of emotions, anger, regret, disbelief, all warring inside him with no clear victor. He had spent years believing he had everything, living in a world where wealth was the only measure of success. Yet now, for the first time, he saw the gaping void in his life, the years lost to a deception he never saw coming. His father had stolen his future, manipulated him like a chess piece, and he had played right into it. The worst part? The years were gone, never to be reclaimed. He couldn't go back to their first steps, their first words, their birthdays. He had missed it all. By the time the first rays of dawn peeked through his massive floor-to-ceiling windows, he had made a decision. He wasn't going to let another moment slip away. His children may not know him, but that was about to change. He would earn their trust, piece by piece, moment by moment, no matter how long it took. With renewed determination, Rayhan dressed quickly, stepping into his sleek black car and heading toward the modest apartment he now knew housed the most important people in his life. The contrast was striking. His world was polished marble and billion-dollar contracts, theirs was worn carpets and homemade holiday decorations. But for the first time, the luxury he surrounded himself with felt hollow. It had been a distraction, a carefully constructed illusion of success. What he truly needed had been hidden away from him for years. When he arrived, he hesitated at the door, feeling something unfamiliar, nervousness. He had closed billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, yet here he was, standing in front of a simple apartment door, palms damp, heart racing. He had no script for this. No calculated business move to lean on. Just raw, unscripted truth. Before he could knock, the door swung open, and he found himself face to face with the little boy from last night. The child blinked up at him, his dark eyes. The same eyes Rayhan saw in the mirror every morning, filled with curiosity and something else, something cautious. Rayhan opened his mouth, but no words came. The boy tilted his head, his small fingers clutching the sleeve of his oversized sweater. "Are you my daddy?" he asked, his voice so quiet it almost got lost in the morning air. The question hit Rayhan harder than he expected. It was the first time he had been called that, the first time he was forced to acknowledge what had been stolen from him in the most innocent, heartbreaking way. He crouched down so they were at eye level, his throat tight. "Yes," he said, his voice rough. "I am." The boy stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Then, instead of saying anything, he simply turned and ran back inside. Rayhan straightened just as Leora appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. He's confused, she said softly. Give him time. Rayhan nodded, stepping inside. The apartment was filled with the scent of coffee and something sweet, pancakes, maybe. The little girl sat at a small table, swinging her legs as she ate, oblivious to the weight of the moment. When she looked up and saw him, she gave him a shy smile. Hi, she said between bites. Hi, Rayhan managed, his heart squeezing at the simple innocence of the greeting. Leora gestured toward the couch. Sit, she said. I told you I'd let you try, but this has to be at their pace, not yours. Rayhan exhaled, rubbing his palms together before taking a seat. He had no idea how to do this. He had spent years negotiating deals, commanding boardrooms, yet he was utterly lost when it came to two little children who shared his blood. The boy reappeared, hovering near the couch, studying him with an intensity that reminded Rayhan so much of himself that it was almost unsettling. Finally, the child spoke. Are you rich? Rayhan blinked at the question, unsure how to answer. I have money, yes. The boy's brows furrowed. Then why don't you have any toys? Rayhan stared at him, caught completely off guard. It took him a moment to realize that to a child, wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts, stocks, or luxury cars. It was measured in something tangible, something real. It was a train set, a ball, a favorite stuffed animal. And in that moment, Rayhan saw himself through his son's eyes, not as a powerful billionaire, but as someone who was missing something essential. He swallowed and leaned forward. I guess I never had anyone to buy them for. The boy thought about that, then nodded slowly. That makes sense. Rayhan's lips twitched at the seriousness of the response. He turned to Leora, who was watching the interaction carefully. I want to take them out today, he said. Just for a few hours. Somewhere fun. Leora hesitated, clearly torn. But then, she glanced at her son, who was still watching Rayhan with curiosity rather than fear. All right, she said finally. But only for a little while. A small victory. Later that afternoon, Rayhan found himself in unfamiliar territory, a children's amusement center. It was loud, chaotic, filled with laughter and high-pitched squeals of excitement. He had never stepped foot in a place like this before, yet now, watching his children light up as they ran from one game to the next, he realized he had been missing something extraordinary his whole life. His son hesitated near the claw machine, his small hands pressed against the glass. Inside sat a brand new version of the teddy bear he carried everywhere. Rayhan saw the way his eyes lit up, the way his fingers twitched with longing. Without hesitation, Rayhan stepped forward, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and handed it to the attendant. How many tries will this buy me? The man looked at the bill, then at Rayhan. All of them? Perfect. 5 minutes later, Rayhan held up the brand new teddy bear in victory, and when he placed it into his son's hands, something in the child's expression shifted, something deeper than just excitement. Trust. For the first time, Rayhan felt it. And it was worth more than every dollar in his bank account. As they left the amusement center, his daughter tugged on his sleeve, looking up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. Will you come for Christmas? She asked. Rayhan crouched down, meeting her gaze. He had missed every Christmas before this one. But not this time. I wouldn't miss it for the world, he whispered. And for the first time in years, he meant it. Rayhan had always believed that power came from control, the ability to shape the world around him, to dictate outcomes, to make others move according to his will. But sitting in Leora's small apartment that night, watching his son fall asleep clutching the new teddy bear, he realized that true power wasn't in controlling people. It was in earning their trust. And trust, he was quickly learning, wasn't something he could buy. It was something fragile, something that had to be built, brick by brick, moment by moment. Leora leaned against the kitchen counter, watching him with an unreadable expression. I don't know what you're expecting, Rayhan, she said, her voice quiet but firm. You spent a few hours with them, and yes, today went well. But that doesn't erase the years you weren't here. Her words stung, but he didn't argue. She was right. A few good hours at an amusement center didn't make him a father. He was still a stranger to them. A stranger who shared their DNA but not their memories. "I don't expect anything, Leora," he said, exhaling slowly. "But I am here now. And I'm not going anywhere." She studied him for a long moment before looking away, stirring the cup of tea in her hands. "You say that," she murmured, "but I don't know if I can believe it." Rayhan felt something sharp twist in his chest. "I don't blame you," he admitted. "But let me prove it." Leora sighed, shaking her head. "It's not that simple, Rayhan. You live in a world that's completely different from ours. And your family," she stopped, her fingers tightening around the mug. "They still have power. Do you really think they'll just let you walk away from the life they built for you?" Rayhan clenched his jaw. His family. The people he had spent years trying to please, the ones who had shaped him into the man he was today, ruthless, efficient, cold when necessary. He had learned everything from them, how to negotiate, how to read people, how to win. But they had also taken from him. They had stolen his children, his chance at a real family. And now, the realization that they had done it so effortlessly, without him even suspecting, made his stomach turn. "I don't care what they think," he said finally, his voice steel. "They took everything from me once. I won't let them do it again." Leora laughed softly, but it wasn't a happy sound. "You say that now. But you don't know what they're capable of. Do you really think they'll just stand by while you abandon the empire they built for you?" Rayhan's fists tightened. He had spent his entire life proving himself to his father, showing that he was strong enough, ruthless enough, worthy enough to carry the family legacy. And what had it gotten him? A life so empty that he hadn't even realized what he was missing until it was too late. He had spent years chasing wealth, thinking that success meant bigger numbers, more power, endless influence. But now, looking at his son curled up with his new teddy bear, his daughter humming softly to herself in the next room, he realized that this simple, quiet life, was worth more than every dollar he had ever earned. "I don't care about the empire," he said, the words foreign and yet strangely freeing as they left his lips. "Let them have it. Let them keep their power. I don't need it anymore." Leora's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to say it. "You're serious?" He nodded. "I am." She let out a slow breath, running a hand through her hair. "Then you need to be ready for what's coming," she warned. "Because they won't let you walk away without a fight." He didn't doubt it. His father had built their empire through sheer force of will, crushing anyone who dared to stand in his way. He would never allow Rayhan to simply choose a different path. But for the first time in his life, Rayhan wasn't afraid. Later that night, as he drove back to his penthouse, his phone rang. He didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. His father. Rayhan exhaled sharply before answering. "I was wondering when you'd call. You think you can just walk away from this?" His father's voice was cold, calm, but Rayhan could hear the underlying fury beneath it. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" "I know exactly what I'm doing," Rayhan replied. "I'm choosing my children over your empire. Over you." His father let out a sharp breath. "And what do you think will happen when this gets out? When people find out you abandoned your position, threw away everything we built?" Rayhan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I didn't throw anything away. You did. The moment you decided to lie to me, to take my children from me." His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "And if you try to interfere again, I will make sure the whole world knows exactly what you did." There was a long silence. Then his father chuckled, but it was a cold, hollow sound. "You think you've won something, boy? You think this story ends with you playing happy family? You have no idea what you've just started." The line went dead. Rayhan exhaled, setting his phone down on the passenger seat. He knew his father well enough to understand that this wasn't over. There would be consequences, battles ahead. But for once in his life, he wasn't afraid of losing. Because for the first time, he had something worth fighting for. Rayhan sat in his car long after the call ended, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The cold voice of his father echoed in his mind, laced with the quiet, calculated menace that had shaped his childhood. This wasn't a man who made empty threats. This was someone who moved pieces on a board before anyone else even realized they were playing a game. Rayhan had been one of those pieces for years, maneuvered and manipulated to fit the family's grand design. But not anymore. He had spent his entire life chasing approval, proving himself worthy of his father's empire, believing that wealth and power were the only currencies that mattered. And yet, standing in Leora's tiny apartment, watching his son cradle a stuffed bear like it was the most precious thing in the world, Rayhan had finally seen the truth. He had been blind. Blind to what truly mattered, blind to the life he could have had if only he had seen through his father's lies sooner. And now that he had opened his eyes, there was no turning back. The next morning, Rayhan didn't return to his office. He didn't check his emails, didn't take his usual morning calls. Instead, he found himself standing outside Leora's building once again, gripping 2 paper cups of coffee as he hesitated before knocking. It was an unfamiliar feeling, uncertainty. He was used to stepping into rooms where he commanded attention, where people adjusted their tone, their words, their very posture, to accommodate his presence. But here, outside this door, he was just a man trying to earn back what he had lost. The door cracked open, and Leora peered at him warily. She was still in her robe, her hair slightly messy from sleep. The sight was strangely intimate, reminding him of a time when things had been simple, when they had woken up in each other's arms, when life hadn't yet been tainted by secrets and betrayals. "You're here early," she murmured, rubbing her eyes. "I brought coffee," he said, holding up the cups like a peace offering. She studied him for a long moment before sighing and stepping aside. "Come in." The apartment was quiet. The kids were still asleep, their small backpacks neatly lined up by the door, shoes tucked underneath. The Christmas tree in the corner looked the same as it had last night, small, simple, but filled with warmth in a way Rayhan's penthouse had never been. Leora took the coffee from him and leaned against the counter. "I assume you didn't come here just to bring me caffeine." Rayhan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I wanted to see them. Spend more time with them." Leora sipped her coffee, watching him carefully. "Rayhan, I don't doubt that you mean well. But this isn't something you can just fix overnight. They don't know you. You can't expect them to just accept you instantly." "I don't," he admitted. "But I have to try. I won't just disappear from their lives again." Leora's gaze softened, but there was still hesitation in her eyes. "And what about your father? Do you really think he'll just let this go?" Rayhan's jaw tightened. "I don't care what he does. He doesn't control me anymore." Leora let out a small, bitter laugh. "You say that now. But you don't know him like I do. He won't stop, Rayhan. He'll dig into my past, into the kids' lives. He'll find anything he can use against me, against us, and he won't stop until you walk away. That's what he does." Rayhan stepped closer, his voice firm. "Then I'll stop him." She blinked at him, startled by the quiet determination in his voice. "For years, I played by his rules," Rayhan continued. "I let him decide what was best for me, let him control my life without question. But this?" He gestured toward the apartment, the small signs of the life she had built. "This isn't a business deal. This isn't some corporate game where I can negotiate terms. This is real. And I won't let him take it from me." Leora held his gaze for a long moment, as if searching for something. Then, slowly, she nodded. "All right," she said softly. "If you're really serious about this, then let's take it one step at a time." A weight lifted from Rayhan's chest. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was a start. Just then, the sound of small footsteps echoed down the hall. His son emerged first, rubbing sleep from his eyes, followed closely by his sister, who clutched a small blanket. The little girl spotted Rayhan and hesitated before stepping closer. "You came back," she said quietly, her tiny voice filled with surprise. Rayhan crouched down so he was at her level. "I told you I would." She studied him for a moment, then nodded, as if deciding that maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. His son, however, was more skeptical. He crossed his arms, looking at Rayhan with a seriousness that made him seem far older than his 6 years. "If you're our dad, then where were you?" The question hit like a punch to the gut, but Rayhan didn't look away. He couldn't. "I didn't know about you," he said honestly. "I should have. I should have been here. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving." The boy didn't respond right away. He just watched him, considering his words. Then, finally, he nodded once, as if granting a cautious approval. "Okay." Rayhan's chest tightened. It wasn't much, but it was something. A step forward. Leora watched the exchange, her expression unreadable. But there was something different in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the possibility that, despite everything, there was a way forward. Rayhan didn't know what the future held. He knew his father wouldn't go down without a fight. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the battle. Because for the first time, he was fighting for something that truly mattered. Rayhan had spent his entire life making decisions that shaped the course of multi-million-dollar deals, signing contracts that determined the fate of entire corporations. He had stood in boardrooms where his presence alone was enough to silence a room, where his name commanded respect and fear in equal measure. But standing in Leora's modest kitchen that morning, watching his children eat breakfast, was the most uncertain he had ever felt. They were still wary of him. He could see it in the way his son hesitated before speaking, in the way his daughter stole cautious glances at him before quickly looking away. They didn't reject him outright, but they weren't running into his arms either. And he couldn't blame them. He was still a stranger to them, a ghost of a father they had never known. Leora placed a cup of coffee in front of him, her movements careful, measured. "They have school today," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "I'll be dropping them off in an hour." Rayhan hesitated before responding. "Can I come?" She blinked, caught off guard. "To drop them off?" He nodded. "I want to see their world. I want to be part of their routine." Leora studied him for a long moment, then turned to her children. "What do you think?" she asked gently. "Would you like your dad to come?" The word dad still sent a jolt through him every time she said it. He hadn't earned the title yet. Not really. But hearing it from her lips made it feel real. His son shrugged, but his daughter nodded shyly. "Okay," she said softly. It wasn't much, but it was something. The drive to school was unlike any drive Rayhan had ever experienced. He was used to being driven in the back of a sleek black car, cutting through city traffic with an urgency that never wavered. But today, he was in the passenger seat of Leora's old, slightly worn-out sedan, the faint scent of crayons and vanilla lingering in the air. The kids sat in the back, talking in hushed voices, as if still unsure of how to act around him. When they pulled up to the school, Rayhan watched as children poured out of cars, backpacks bouncing as they ran toward the entrance. He had never paid attention to places like this before. It was a world completely separate from his own, yet now, it felt like the most important place in existence. His son unbuckled his seatbelt but paused before getting out. He turned to Rayhan, as if debating something. Then, after a moment, he finally spoke. "Are you gonna pick us up?" Rayhan's chest tightened at the question. The unspoken words lingered in the air, "Or will you be gone again?" "If you want me to," Rayhan said carefully. The boy hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Okay." Rayhan wasn't sure if he had ever felt relief quite like this. As they disappeared into the school building, Leora let out a slow breath. They're warming up to you, she admitted. I can see it. Rayhan looked at her. But you're still not sure if I'll stay. Leora tightened her grip on the steering wheel. I've had to be strong for them, Rayhan. I've had to do everything on my own. You showing up now, after all these years. It's hard to believe it's real. Rayhan reached for her hand, hesitating just before touching it. I am real. And I'm not leaving. She closed her eyes for a moment before nodding. Then prove it. That night, Rayhan found himself sitting in his penthouse, staring out over the city he once thought he ruled. But for the first time it felt empty. He had built his empire from nothing, turned himself into one of the most powerful men in the country. But power suddenly felt insignificant. His father's voice still echoed in his head. You think this story ends with you playing happy family? Rayhan exhaled, his jaw tightening. He knew his father wasn't done. And he was right about one thing, this wasn't the end. The next morning, as he drove to pick up his children, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. It wasn't his father this time. It was his lawyer. You need to come to the office, the man said, his tone urgent. Your father is making a move. Rayhan gripped the wheel tighter. What kind of move? He's challenging your position in the company. He's calling a meeting with the board, claiming you're unstable. That you're making irrational decisions. Rayhan's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what this was. His father was trying to push him out, painting him as a liability. And if the board sided with him, Rayhan could lose everything. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of losing it. Because for the first time, he had something worth walking away for. As he pulled up to the school, his son and daughter came running toward the car, their faces lighting up when they saw him. His son slid into the front seat this time, more comfortable than he had been the day before. Did you bring snacks? The boy asked, eyeing him suspiciously. Rayhan chuckled. Of course. He reached into the back seat and pulled out a bag of cookies. His son grabbed one, nodding in approval. Not bad, he said through a mouthful. His daughter giggled, and Rayhan felt something inside him settle. This small moment of laughter, of shared cookies and warmth, this was worth more than any boardroom, any title, any empire. Leora glanced at him from the driver's seat, something soft in her expression. Looks like you survived another day. Rayhan smirked. One step at a time. But as he looked at his children, at the life he was slowly stepping into, he knew one thing for certain, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Even if his father tried to destroy him, even if the world turned against him, he would not walk away. Because for the first time in his life, he understood the true meaning of wealth. And he wasn't going to lose it again. Rayhan had spent his entire life believing that power meant control. That success meant standing at the top, untouchable, commanding respect through fear, influence, and wealth. But as he sat in the small apartment that now felt more like home than his penthouse ever had, watching his children decorate the Christmas tree with Leora, he realized just how wrong he had been. His father had called a war against him. The board of directors had gathered, a room full of men who had once bowed to his authority, now whispering about his supposed emotional instability. His father had spun the story well. Rayhan had abandoned his role, thrown his life's work away for a woman from his past, for children he had never known. He was reckless, distracted, a liability to the company. The empire his family had spent generations building couldn't afford a weakness like him at its helm. For the first time, Rayhan hadn't fought back. He hadn't gathered his legal team, hadn't strategized a counterattack. He had simply walked into that boardroom, looked his father in the eye, and said, "You can have it." A stunned silence had followed. His father's smug smirk had faltered, just slightly, before he realized the full weight of what had just happened. Rayhan had handed him the empire. Given it up without a fight. His father had spent years preparing for war, and Rayhan had simply walked away. Because, for the first time in his life, the empire didn't matter. That had been 2 days ago. And now, he was here. sitting on a couch that wasn't made of Italian leather but was warm, comfortable, real. He had spent the last 48 hours doing things he had never imagined himself doing, helping Leora bake cookies in a tiny kitchen, wrapping presents with wrapping paper that refused to fold properly, sitting on the floor and assembling a toy castle with his daughter, his fingers fumbling with the tiny plastic pieces as she laughed at his frustration. And now, on Christmas Eve, he was watching his children, hang ornaments on a tiny tree. His son placed the star on top, balancing on his tiptoes, his little face glowing with pride as Leora steadied him. Rayhan had never felt wealthier in his entire life. Leora sat down beside him, curling her fingers around her mug of tea, watching the children with a soft expression. She hadn't said much about his decision to leave his father's company. But she had seen the headlines. Billionaire heir steps down, a scandal or a new beginning? The media was already speculating about his fall from grace, dissecting his actions, trying to find a reason behind them. She finally glanced at him, her voice quiet. So, what now? Rayhan exhaled, leaning back against the couch. He had spent years waking up to a schedule that dictated every moment of his life. Mornings filled with meetings, afternoons spent negotiating contracts, evenings locked in boardrooms. Every hour had been accounted for. Every move had been strategic. Now, for the first time, he had no plan. I don't know, he admitted. But I think I'm okay with that. Leora studied him for a long moment. You really gave it all up? He nodded. Yeah. Do you regret it? Rayhan turned his gaze back to his children, watching as his daughter carefully arranged the ornaments on the lower branches, her tiny hands adjusting them with precision. His son stepped back, inspecting his work with the seriousness of an architect designing a skyscraper. And Rayhan smiled. Not for a second. Leora let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. I still can't believe it. Rayhan turned to her. You don't have to. He reached for her hand, hesitating for just a moment before clasping it gently. But you can believe in me. She didn't pull away. The doorbell rang, breaking the moment. Leora frowned. Who would be coming by this late? Rayhan's stomach tightened. He had a feeling he already knew. When he opened the door, his father stood there, flanked by two of his lawyers. The older man's face was unreadable, but Rayhan knew that look well. It was the same look he had given when closing deals, when making final, irreversible decisions. For the first time, Rayhan wasn't intimidated by it. I hope you've had enough time to think, his father said smoothly, stepping inside as if he owned the place. His eyes barely flickered over the modest surroundings, but Rayhan knew that in his mind, he was already judging. Calculating. You made an emotional decision. A foolish one. But it's not too late to fix it. Rayhan folded his arms. You came all the way here to tell me that? His father's jaw tightened slightly. Come back, Rayhan. Before this becomes something you can't undo. Rayhan shook his head. I'm not undoing anything. His father let out a slow, measured sigh, as if disappointed. You were raised for more than this. You're throwing your legacy away. Rayhan turned, glancing at his children, who were now watching the conversation unfold with wide eyes. He looked at Leora, standing protectively near them, her face guarded but strong. And then he smiled. No, he said quietly. I'm finally claiming it. His father's expression hardened. You'll regret this. Rayhan met his gaze without flinching. I already regret every year I spent trying to live up to your expectations. He took a step forward, lowering his voice so that only his father could hear. You took my family from me once. You don't get to do it again. For the first time in his life, his father had no response. He turned without another word, his lawyers following him in stiff silence. Rayhan shut the door, exhaling slowly before turning back to his family. His family. The realization hit him again, and this time, it didn't come with anger or grief, it came with peace. His son hesitated, then walked up to him, staring up with the same sharp, intelligent eyes Rayhan saw in the mirror every day. "So, you're staying?" Rayhan crouched down, meeting his son's gaze. He reached out, ruffling his dark hair, his voice filled with something rare, certainty. "I'm staying." His daughter beamed, and without hesitation, she threw her small arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. His son was slower to follow, but after a moment, he wrapped his arms around his father too. Leora watched them, her eyes shining with something unspoken. Rayhan pulled back just enough to look at them, his heart full in a way it had never been before. "Merry Christmas," he whispered. And for the first time, it actually meant something.